Welcome to the Gynarchy Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kirti Patel. Here we place women's health and feminism front and center where they belong, engaging in conversations that range from the fundamental to the fearless. With insights from expert guests, we aim to break through the barriers of the patriarchy and envision a new world led by the Gynarchy. So let's get started and dive right in. Welcome to the Gynarchy Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kirti Patel, and today we're going to be talking about shattering glass walls or gender bias barriers with Amy Diehl. So Dr. Amy Diehl is an award-winning information technology leader, currently serving as Chief Information Officer at Wilson College in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. She is also a gender equity researcher and author of the new book, Glass Walls, Shattering the 6 Gender Bias Barriers Still Holding Women Back at Work. Her writing has appeared in numerous scholarly journal articles and book chapters, as well as in Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and Ms. Magazine. She is also a sought-after speaker, consultant, and lawsuit expert witness. Her passion is universal gender equality so that society and organizations can thrive and women can succeed. Welcome, Amy. How are you today?
I am good. Thank you so much for having me, Kirti.
Thank you so much for being on. So I have to admit, I read this book months ago. We were originally going to record in the fall and we rescheduled. So I apologize if it's not fresh in my mind, but I did skim over it again. So I love to start these episodes by asking my guests to tell me a little bit about themselves and, also how you just came to work on this book.
Yeah, I can start from the beginning.
Whatever you'd like.
Yeah. I'll start with college. When I went to college, I was a computer science major. Okay. And so that field is male dominated. It was male dominated when I was there. It was even more so today, unfortunately. But I did really well in my computer science courses. I did really well in college, and I never really felt that there was anything about my gender that was holding me back. And it wasn't until I went into the world of work where I started to recognize that maybe women were facing barriers. And what was interesting about that was it took me a period of time, like working in an organization for a period of years, before I started to suspect that gender or being a woman was causing me barriers and caused anybody, anybody barriers. And, one of the things that I remember happening to me is that as I was at one point I took over a team that my former male boss had led. And it's an information technology team. So it's mostly, in fact, it was all male subordinates. Mm-hmm. And so I had spent years like watching my male boss, watching how he led and watching how other men around me led, right? And that was my primary like training ground. Like that's how I learned to lead. And so I thought, okay, now I'm in charge of this team. I'm going to do and act exactly the same way that I've seen my boss be successful, right? And one memory that just sticks with me is at one point I was leading a group discussion of my team, and we had several different options to choose from. I don't even remember what the thing was that we were discussing, but there were several different options, different ways that we could go. And at the end of the meeting, we had no consensus. And so I picked one of the paths. Like I picked the path that I felt was going to be the most appropriate. And I came out of that meeting, and my male subordinates were like, "What is she doing?" Like I immediately figured out that like I had lost points with them. But I had watched time after time after time after time, whenever my male boss was leading the meeting and we had that same dynamic, he would, at the end of the meeting, he would just say, "Okay, there's not consensus. That's okay. We're just going to go do this." And the team would follow along, no pushback. And so I'm like, what is happening? Like, why am I getting such a different result, right? It wasn't until I started my PhD program that it was about that time frame that I started to suspect that, hey, maybe it's something with my gender. Like maybe it's not a personal failing on my part, which is what I thought it was. Maybe it's something related to, being a woman in a male dominated field or being a woman who's a leader. And so when I started my PhD program, that was the time I took the opportunity to really study barriers, like do literature review and study barriers that women were facing. And at that time, there wasn't nearly as much research out there as there is today, which is why I was able to jump in and, sort of, start to create some of the research myself. So throughout my program, I researched these barriers and I wrote my dissertation. I finished. A year after I finished my dissertation, I met my now co-author, Dr. Dzubinski, at a conference, and we immediately connected. And we connected over the fact that we had both, for our dissertations, we had both interviewed women in male-dominated fields. In my case, I was working with women who were in higher education, who were leading in higher education. She had interviewed women who were leading in the faith-based nonprofit world, so like religion. And we immediately connected because we started sharing like what challenges the women were facing. And we realized very quickly it was the same challenges, just in different fields. And then we really connected we came to the realization that, hey, maybe like it wasn't something to do with a particular field. She in particular felt that maybe like the religion, religion was she felt it was very different and it is very patriarchal and is, very conservative. But I know she was really surprised to see that a more progressive field, a field that's thought to be more progressive, like higher education, women were dealing with the same things. And so we came to the conclusion that it wasn't about the women themselves. It wasn't about the organizational type. It was about women. It was about being a woman in a role or an organization or a position that's male dominated or male stereotyped. And so that was the beginning of our collaboration. It took us a total of 10 years of collaborating before the book was published. We published journal articles and popular press articles, and then it culminated in the publishing of our book, Glass Walls.
Great. Oh, and I noticed the book in the back, and I forgot to show my copy. But yes, yes, but I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot from it. Actually, so I want to first ask you a few questions about stuff you said, but I do want to get into the book. What was your dissertation on specifically?
So, yeah, that's a good question. I interviewed 26 women leaders in higher education about how they made meaning of adversity. And so I asked them questions about what was your most significant professional adversity? What was your most significant personal adversity? And then I had follow-up questions about, tell me about all the barriers. Tell me about the barriers that you have felt, that you have faced in the workforce, in your working career. And so that's where I gleaned the gender barriers. That's where I gleaned the first sort of list. I had 12 of them that I published in my dissertation. The first list of barriers that women were facing.
Was your co-author and partner what was her dissertation? Did you just see a lot of overlaps then?
Yeah, it was really interesting because it was a similar topic, except that she was looking at challenges that women faced in, again, the faith-based nonprofit industry, which is like the evangelical missions organizations, very conservative organizations. And so it was kind of coming at it, like a very similar types of questions that we were asking. Tell me about the challenges, tell me about barriers, tell me about adversity that you've experienced. And what was really interesting was that she published her dissertation. I published my dissertation at about the same time. It was both were published around 2013. And what I ended up doing was I took a look at her dissertation, and she had identified barriers that I had not identified. One of them that I recall vividly is the one that's called male gatekeeping. It's where the men at the top of the organization, it's kind of like the bro code. They hire all their buddies. And it's not that they don't let any women in, but they let one or two maybe women in who are not going to be won't contradict them, who will support them, right? Who will will go along with the male control of the organization. So anyway, she had identified that as one example in her dissertation. And so our first research effort was we pulled the barriers that she had identified out of her dissertation. We pulled the ones I identified out of my dissertation. And then we took our data sets and we looked. I looked for her barriers in my data set, and she looked for hers, my barriers in her data set. And they were all there. So what was really, really interesting about it was until I didn't have the names, I didn't have this name or this concept of male gatekeeping. It wasn't in the literature. I didn't have the concept to go looking for it. But as soon as I had the concept, Then I start looking through my data. There it is. There it is. There it is. And it was like that for everything that she had identified and everything that I had identified. It was at least one example, if not multiple examples, of each of the barriers that we had pulled out of our respective dissertations. It was just really fascinating, that this is there and you don't see it. Like you don't see it, like you're reading, I knew my dissertation data. I had listened to these interviews that I had done multiple times and I could recite them because I had to, I listened to them, I transcribed them, I listened to them again, to edit the transcriptions. I read the transcriptions, but until you have like a framework or until you know what you're looking for, you're not going to see it. Right. And so that was just a very interesting process.
I loved that you guys collaborated and put a name on these problems, and that, I feel like we know when there's a problem going on, but when you don't have a name for it, it's like it's hard to identify or tackle it, right? Yeah. So your book was, okay, I'm a vocabulary nerd. I love it. And I learned so many new words. You coined new words. I mean, isn't glass walls also a term you coined?
Yeah, they had been, if you do, there's probably others that have like used it, but we're the ones, I think we're really the first that has really made prominent use of it in the space of women and the barriers that they face, right? People ask, how's that different from a glass ceiling? Right. And a glass ceiling is a real concept, right? It's there. Like as people, as women move up, like there's a ceiling, it gets harder and harder as you move up, but it's not just that ceiling. There's like these walls, they surround us and like they're invisible. It's like you often don't know until you run smack dab into it. And like you were saying, like if you don't have the name for something, you may run smack dab into something that you can't even name. And so then how do you address it? How do you describe it? How do you even have the like you were saying, the vocabulary to converse about it, right? And so that's again our goal to help give people names to comprehensively identify this concept, all the things that make up gender bias, and then give people names and terminology to use to.
Yes. And I think, everyone knows what a glass ceiling is. And then there's also the glass cliff, right? So I think this is helpful because I think we've all been as women in positions where we felt some kind of discrimination, but we didn't know how to verbalize it or pinpoint it. So if you could share what those 6 glass walls are now, that would be great. We can start talking about each of them.
Yeah. So in the book, we break it down into the 6 primary barriers, which before I describe them, I'll just make a note and say that these 6 barriers, we didn't just pull them out of our head. We didn't just write about the 6 barriers that we even get written about or get discussed the most frequently. We derive these from doing factor analysis on a scale that we built to measure gender bias. So I just wanted to say that these 6 barriers were derived in a very scientific way. And we really feel like these make up the foundation of what this concept of gender bias is. And so in the book, we talk about the 6 barriers, and then we give all kinds of examples. And so the first one is male privilege. Male privilege is men's inherent advantage caused by workplace cultures in which men are the leaders. They control the resources, they set the standards, and they assign women to a second-class status. And we conceptualize male privilege as serving as the bedrock from which all the other barriers grow. Disproportionate constraints. Women are constrained to act in ways that are supportive of men and held to unequal standards compared to men. One type of disproportionate constraint is like when women's voices are muted, or whenever we're silenced, interrupted. And what we believe is that disproportionate constraints, they tend to be the most subtle, but also the most prevalent because they happen to us every day. And I mentioned interrupting in meetings. Another concept, a term that we did not coin, but that we use in the book is called heap-heating. And heap-heating means when a woman says something and it's ignored, and then a man says the same thing and everyone loves it, and therefore the man gets the credit, right? Third one is insufficient support. That's women's lack of access to social structures and networks that would help them advance, which also includes unsupportive leadership in which the leaders ignore the women's needs or concerns, trivialize them, or even disbelieve women who report discrimination or harassment. Fourth barrier is devaluation. It's attempts to make women seem unimportant and detract from their authority. Examples are things like being paid less than men for the same work, being assigned to office housework, like taking notes in the meeting, cleaning the office refrigerator, planning the office party. And also another type of devaluation example is when their words are not believed because they're coming from a woman. And this is a word that we did coin. It's called credibility deficit. Okay, fifth one, hostility. Hostility is an active resistance to women's presence in the workplace through overt discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. And it's the goal of hostility is to keep women in their supposed place. And Curdy, if you read the book, you know that we also talk about female hostility. Not all hostility comes from men. Sometimes women are hostile towards other women. And it's because really of the male-dominated or the male-normed environment, women may feel insecure in their own positions and therefore try to keep other women down. And then last of the 6 barriers is acquiescence. So due to the combined weight of the other barriers, women may internalize the obstacles, accept them as valid, and adapt to the limitations. So they may self-silence, they may keep quiet on workplace sexism or even harassment that happens to them. And that's for their own self-protection. And then they may also have self-limited aspirations. And that's where women either feel that they are not capable of advancement because they have internalized all the messages that they've, received from the environment and from others. Or some women, in our research, we found some women actually believe that they were capable, but they very rationally they very rationally limit their own aspirations because they didn't want to deal with all the hassles and the mental anguish and the grief that men just did not have. So that's a quick synopsis of the 6.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, no, at many points I found very relatable. We can all, I'm sure, come up with, it was great to put names on each of these because we as women have all experienced some or, many of them. In fact, mostly more than one usually.
Oh, yeah.
So yes. So let's get into each one and I'll dig in a little bit more because there was a lot to talk about each. So male privilege, you mentioned, that's the basis of this bias that exists. And there were a lot of different terms here as well. Like you mentioned, the gatekeeping. Yeah, so let's get into some examples, most common examples, I guess, of what goes on.
Well, I talked about male gatekeeping already, so we'll bypass that one for now. Although that one is used, unfortunately, still used everywhere. The boys' club, like a bro culture, that's often very prevalent, especially in certain industries, like the tech industry, very, very prevalent. But in other industries too, where it's just you have this culture. Sometimes the boys club culture, sometimes it's like really overtly harmful and really overtly sexist, right? But sometimes it's just, this culture where you walk into a meeting, before the meeting starts, everybody's sitting there chit-chatting about sports. Yes. Nothing wrong with sports, nothing wrong with being a sports fan. Many women are sports fans, but many men are sports fans, but many men are not sports fans and many women are not sports fans. But I've found that when I'd walk into these meetings and people were talking about the latest game or whatever, if I'm not up on that particular league or that particular, those events, then I'm left out of the conversation. And, and so I'm just, not able to engage in that kind of camaraderie, that's forming amongst the men. You mentioned the glass cliff. That's another type of male privilege, and that's when a woman gets she gets into a role when an organization, a leadership role, when an organization is in peril or in a state of crisis or in a downturn, and she is expected to do the miraculous, which is turn it around. And often women, what will happen is women will think, oh my gosh, this is my chance. I'm so happy I've been chosen for this role. I'm going to take it. And I think a lot of times that women are not told the full story when they're going into these roles, and they're not given the full support. They're just sort of expected to take care of whatever the issues are, whatever the issues are.
Right. I mean, they often, they seem like sacrificial lambs, almost like a setup. And then
exactly.
When they fail, a man swoops in, you know?
Yeah, exactly. They get blamed. Like they get blamed. It's like, oh, it's her fault. And then the man, and then so many times you see it's a white man is put in an interim role or the permanent role as the successor. And then it says it's to signal return to the quote unquote status quo. And unfortunately, the way that it works is it becomes when that woman failed because she was set up to fail, but it becomes more of, the blame goes to, okay, she failed, but hey, we can't have a woman as a leader because look what happened in this example.
Right. Meanwhile, all indicators suggested that when she was put in the role, it was already on a downturn, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah. Oh, and the sports metaphors, I just want to throw in, I'm not a sports fan, okay? Very much. Like, I'm very light and only certain things. And so, I never found that very relatable. And it sort of reminds me of the advice of, I feel like, a while ago, I don't know, maybe quite a while ago, I remember for a bit, people were recommending women take golf lessons.
Oh, yeah.
to be able to participate. And I was like, that's strange. Like, I'm going to take up golf just to rub elbows.
Yeah, we talk about that in the book too, because that advice to women is well-meaning because it's get yourself into those networks. But really the advice needs to be, if you are the men in those golf networks, stop discussing work out on the golf course, or at the bar, whatever your male club your male
or the strip club, you mentioned in the book. That seems like it's still going on.
Yes, unfortunately.
Right. Oh, yeah. You gave the example of that tech industry, a lawsuit, right? Because I think they were talking about
Ellen Powell.
Yes.
She worked.
That was a good example.
Kleiner Perkins, she worked in investing, and so she was somebody who was she had the resources because she was a venture capitalist, right? She had the resources, to fight back, after what she had been through, right? She had more resources than most women, right? But but as I write in the book, she sued her employer, Kleiner Perkins, but while she was a millionaire, this company is in the billions, right?
Right.
They put not just the money that they put into their lawyers, right? They put a whole PR campaign against her, and her husband, to try to, to win her case, which they eventually won. Unfortunately, the company eventually was successful. Her book, it's called Reset. It's a very, very interesting book. And
it's a good recommendation. Okay, I'll have to look at that.
If you read her book and then you compare to the Glass Walls, it's she went everything that we talk about in Glass Walls. She
all of it,
that she had encountered. I mean, she doesn't necessarily use our words, because our book was.
She didn't even have the words, probably.
But she's describing exactly what. Yeah.
Yes. And you had mentioned that. Yeah, I thought that was a good, interesting how, your colleague had said that she thought it was just a faith-based organization thing. But when you talk to women in different industries, I mean, I can tell you in medicine, it's, same struggles. And then now we see in government what a bro culture. I mean, they're calling it the broligarchy, right?
Yeah.
And it's true, these tech guys. And politicians very much doing the same thing and overtly doing it, not even hiding anymore. So,
I know. I don't know. In some ways, it's is that better or worse? I don't know. When it's subtle, my job, or what we try to do is name all of it, and when it's subtle, call it out. When when it's overt, it's overt. You're right. It has. They're no longer even trying to hide it.
Right.
But if you want to go back to medicine for a moment, that's really interesting because medicine is female dominated as an industry, right? And yet the sexism still exists there. I just posted on a study onto my social media. It was about academic medicine, but it had looked at all of the academic medicine, the physicians from the years 1979 to 2019. More women were hired into the entry-level roles, like the assistant professor, associate professor roles, but the higher level roles and the leadership roles were still being dominated by men. So,
yes,
even in these female-dominated
industries, yes,
it still exists, right? And it still the goal is to keep women in supportive roles.
Yes.
It's often that it's not that they don't want women around. They just want women to support the patriarchy, to support the men's privilege, right?
Right.
To allow the men to do whatever they want to do, and to be supportive and not counter anything that would impede their status in the gender.
Right. I know. I think early in the book you mentioned that, what women are primarily valued for is their supportive role and using feminine stereotypes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're kind of straying from that, like you gave in your example, you're of leading the team and you're, I don't know, acting like a man. They're trying to put you in your place, silence you, right?
Exactly. And it's just such, when you're a leader, when you're in a position of any kind of leadership, whether you're the person at the top or I'm just at that point in time, I was one step up in the organizational hierarchy, right? I was no longer an individual contributor. I was basically a manager of a team at that point. Mm-hmm. But even being, just one step up, the stereotypes kick in, right? And the stereotypes kick in for all of us. And for my teammates, for my coworkers to say, hey, this isn't right. Amy's being authoritative and that doesn't feel right to me, right?
Right.
Amy's trying to tell us what to do.
Too bossy.
Yeah, right. That doesn't
inappropriate.
But it comes from my male boss, or my male coworker or my male colleague. That feels right, because that's what how we've been socialized. We need to be unsocialized. And
I've experienced that. I feel like I have to, you can't. I think women know how to do this because we live in this patriarchal world, right? We know how to ask people to do things in a way that is not threatening, which is kind of messed up. Why can't you just be direct and say, I need you to get this done? Yeah. Instead of being when you have a minute, so I feel like I've definitely seen that. I feel in medicine too, how male doctors behave versus how female doctors behave, there's a little more politeness or, you have to wrap it in femininity.
Yeah. What I found,
being maternal or being supportive,
Yeah, absolutely. What I found, it was funny because after I had that experience, with not getting great feedback from me making a decision, I realized that what I needed to do as a woman was to take the time to say, okay, this is the way I'm thinking about going with this decision. How do you feel about that? And how do you feel about that? And how do you feel about that? And I had to go and check in with each and every person to hear what they thought.
Buy-in first.
And get their buy-in.
Wow.
And you can look at it two ways. One way is that took me extra time, again, whereas the man in a similar position could just say, we're just going to do this, and everybody accepts it. On the other hand, me taking the time to do that actually does help the employees to feel valued and that their thoughts and that their ideas matter, right? So maybe, in some cases it would be better if my male boss had gone to that, more collaborative approach, right? It's not to say in decision making you always have time, you don't always have time to go and check in with everybody, but making everybody feel part of the solution, and actually be part of the solution is a good thing.
Right. Yeah. So I can tell that we're not going to be able to get to every last thing. So one thing under the male privilege barrier that I found really interesting and something I hadn't thought about enough, but I'm so glad to have learned about it, was that two-person career structure, which was so fascinating because I think that is so I'd like you to share with my audience about that because I think we need to try to observe this more in society.
Yeah. So here's another one that was identified in Dr. Dzubinski's dissertation that I didn't identify in mine, but it actually existed in mine. I didn't surface it when I was doing the initial, my initial dissertation work. So two-person career structure is basically a buy one, get one free structure for an organization. Buy one leader, you get the service of the person's spouse, i.e. their wife, for free. My co-author, she actually was the second person in her because she came out of the evangelical missions. She and her husband worked in those organizations, and she worked under that structure. And so her husband was hired, and then it was like, oh, well, what can you do and how can you contribute to the organization? And then she was expected to, jump in and do all kinds of work for the organization without any extra compensation. Right. And so the interesting thing about that, and you'll see that often in like churches, if you're, or, religious organizations that hire a male, let's say they hire a male pastor, and then, the pastor's wife does all kinds of hosting and greeting and leading Bible study or, whatever the roles are. But what was interesting is, so I go back to my dissertation, right? And I start looking through my dissertation data, and I start looking through the data. Yeah, it was in there. And because this is very common amongst university presidents too, right?
Oh, right.
You hire the university president, and the wife is expected to host events.
Social events,
right? To organize them, to... in fact, I gave an example in the book. There was a university where the university president was supposed to speak at like an orientation or some kind of, meeting with like students or new students. He was not available. I think he was traveling, he was delayed or something. So who steps in his place? His wife stepped in. His wife, his unpaid spouse, stepped in.
No contract.
Reading and do that. Right.
Right.
And, I look at that and I'm like, for me, like the organization should have had their provost step in or another vice president, right? There's plenty of paid people who could have stepped in to speak for the president, but they chose or whatever to have the wife do it again. It's not that any of these, there's nothing wrong with any of these roles of organizing parties or stepping in for a speaking engagement. The problem is it's not compensated.
Right.
This person's time is not being compensated. And so you see it often, like I said, I found it in the university presidencies. There are other high level roles, government officials.
Yes. It made me think of the first lady role.
Yes.
And I'm not the biggest fan of Melania Trump, but I kind of love that she is a bit, not too enamored with that role. I'm like, good. I mean, no one's paying her, so I kind of get it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, Dr. Jill Biden, she kept her teaching job while she was first lady, she was the first lady to ever have an outside employment, while being first lady.
Yeah.
I mean, which I thought was,
I know. And Michelle Obama gave up her career. So it's, it's just such a high level example of women making sacrifices in favor of the man's career, prioritizing the man's career,
Yeah, absolutely.
So was there anything else under male privilege that you felt important to bring up, or we can move to the next one?
I think we move on. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. But I do want to point out that there's a lot. And so I do highly recommend all women read this book because
we're only scratching the surface.
Right. In an hour, we can only cover so much. So, so the next one, disproportionate constraints. Tell us about some big examples.
Well, we talked about muting women's voices, which is likely the most prevalent barrier. Like I said, it's something that happens every day to so many of us. And it's like just being interrupted in a meeting, if you've ever been in a meeting where the men are sort of like, fighting for airtime and you're just sitting back and like, I just want you're just waiting for that spot to like, hey, I have a point too. Or if you start making the point and, all of a sudden you're cut off. Now, a good facilitator for the meeting will not let that happen. Which, like, there are ways around all of these behaviors, all of these things, right? But if you've not really got good facilitation, then it's like whoever speaks the loudest, whoever's the most, the boldest or whatever, gets their points in. We talked about the heap heating, another term that we, again, did not coin this term, but we expose it in the book. It's called bro-appropriating. And that's,
yes, I love that.
And that's a little bit more than heap heating. Like heap heating, I think often like the man who's heap heating, like when that happens, like it's not necessarily intentional. Bro-appropriating is much more intentional, where a man intentionally takes a woman's idea and claims it as his own, like appropriates the idea and then takes the credit. We talk about mansplaining. I think most people have heard of mansplaining. We all know
that one.
Yeah. And I'm sure
anyone on social media.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, where you have your own expertise, explained to you by a man who's got, far less, experience in whatever the thing is. Yeah. So we talk about in that disproportionate constraints. Also, we talk about unequal standards, how, women have to work twice as hard to, get the same, to get an attempt at the same result, right? And if you want to talk about like politics, you think about Hillary Clinton and I think about Kamala Harris, right?
Right.
They
exceptionally prepared.
Exceptionally prepared. Their
Yes.
careers, were had prepared them to run for, U.S. president, but yet they both lost to the same person who was somebody with inarguably far less experience, right?
Yes. Not just mediocre, like unqualified and actually terrible. Like, they talk about wanting to eliminate DEI, and instead because they think somehow this is getting people who are not prepared into these, or, with enough credentials into these positions. But all we see now is the most mediocre or unqualified people, white men, honestly, terrible, sorry to say, but it's kind of comical. I hate to say, dark and comic.
Yeah. If, that meritocracy, which doesn't truly exist, but if they truly wanted meritocracy, if it was a true meritocracy, white men would not be in as many positions of power as they would, nearly as many as they are in now, right?
Absolutely. What we do have is DEI for white men.
Yeah.
And something I love telling people who want to argue with me about DEI is, well, if we really had a DEI, if we really had a meritocracy, rather, you would see, many more like Asian people in the positions, or, women in these positions. So clearly, like, I don't think it should be that. I think we should reflect the population, every organization, because that's what's fair and makes things equal. Yeah. So,
for sure. And so, I'll keep with the Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris example. Those unequal standards, they are also scrutinized in ways that the men are just not scrutinized, like their clothing. There was an article in the New York Times about former Vice President Harris, and the picture with the article had Vice President Harris in 6 different pantsuits, right? It was 6 different images of her in a pantsuit. And in the article, about maybe 3 paragraphs down, it had the question, but is it her clothing? Is her clothing presidential? Does it look presidential? Like, how else, like with this picture, especially with this picture, like, how else is she supposed to dress? She's wearing the female equivalent of the male pantsuit. And yet she gets this whole article about her that is, it's kind of critiquing her, or, talking about discussing her dress, but then asking if she's looking presidential enough. And, really what the article is getting at is that, does a woman look like she can be president? Does a woman fit the stereotype for the United States presidency? Right.
When all the presidents have been white men except for Obama, like she can't look like them or dress like them. I guess you could say maybe a powdered wig and a white ruffle collar like Washington.
And like, where was the article asking if, now President Trump, asking if he looked if his attire looked presidential, I think there's some scrutiny around, and I have seen little, tidbits here and there that, of some articles about his suits maybe being wrinkled, or the very long tie and, different things. But there's never an article that said, oh, does he look presidential or not? Like, that's not even questioned, right?
Right.
And so the thing is, so I'm using these really high level examples, but the thing that we have to realize is that these, like, everyday women in everyday positions, we still suffer from the same types of scrutiny, just not, on this national stage, or maybe not written about in the New York Times, right? If I'm not wearing, a certain type of attire, perhaps to my workplace, are people looking at me and saying, like, I wouldn't ever dare, like, in my workplace, I wouldn't ever dare wear jeans, for example. Not even like on a casual day, like, I just know that, like, that's going to take away from my perceived authority. But yet I've got male counterparts that wear, jeans to like an organizational retreat or whatever. And like, doesn't take away from their authority.
Right. A lot of these tech guys just wear t-shirts. Like, okay. A woman couldn't show up like that,
Yeah, exactly.
So Okay, insufficient support. What are some
Yeah, so
example
insufficient
or a
support
big
is like
example?
almost like the lack of. It's like the lack of mentoring, the lack of being sponsored. And those two things have been written about a lot. We also talk about women having to deal with unsupportive leadership. And in my dissertation research, so I was looking at how women make meaning of adversity. Like they go through this adverse experience, what does it mean to them and to their, to their lives, right? The thing that I found, I had a number of women who dealt with leaders who just didn't support them, like their direct supervisor, or their boss or whatever, did not support them. And the thing that was most interesting about it was like they could like that was the most difficult for them to make sense of. Like
Mhm.
and other types of adversity that women would talk to me about, and they could like make more sense and meaning of than what they could the unsupportive leadership. And I think it was the kind of this idea of like, well, you hired me to do this role, or I'm in this role where I'm here trying to do my best for the organization. Why aren't you supporting me? Why are you, harassing? Like in some case, it was harassment, right? Why are you harassing me? And looking back on it, I think, well, I can understand the gender dynamics at play, right? The harassment, they're trying to keep the women in their place. But for the women personally, like they just really, really struggled, to make meaning of that. And
Right.
so we really broke that down that particular one down in the book of all the different ways
Yes.
that leaders can fail to support the women that are working for them.
Yeah, I like in the book that you mentioned, a lot of times, I mean, they want the women around because they're very valuable and they're doing valuable work. They're often doing it better, more efficiently, and carrying an incredible load, but they don't want them getting too
They can't have an opinion,
powerful, right?
Yeah, and they can't have too much power, and they don't want to upend their apple cart. They can't upend, the men just feel very threatened, I think, in ways that they shouldn't. Like if you're working for an organization, you should be thinking about what's best for the organization, right? If you are thinking about as a man or a woman, what's best for the organization, how can I make, most positive impact on this organization? Well, the most positive impact may be, having women, like lots of women in leadership roles or whatever, allowing women to make decisions. But when you feel threatened by that, you're really just harming the organization.
Right. Okay, so the next one is devaluation.
Yeah, we talked about office housework.
Yes,
we talked about, of course, salary inequality. That one is like we could, unfortunately,
I know, that's
still a
an
thing,
entire
right?
episode.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we talked about a credibility deficit. If you've ever been like, if you've ever said something, if you ever made a statement out of your own expertise, and the man next to you says, "Are you sure?" Or that man looks at somebody, like if you've got somebody beside you and they look to your coworker and say, "Is she right about that?" Like that's credibility deficit. And what we found in our research is that women had ways to get around it, but there are ways where, like, especially women of color, were really felt very impacted by this. Like one woman of color in our research said that what she would do is when she was being introduced to new people, she would give a synopsis of her resume before she even started to speak about whatever the topic was. So she would have to say, like, I'm so-and-so, and I've got so-and-so degrees, such and such degrees, and I've got such and such experience. And now I can speak about whatever the thing is, right? Like the man just comes into the meeting and just starts speaking, right?
Right. With enough confidence, and people just trust automatically. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, and I think, that also reminds me of just how a lot of us women have gone through just feeling, what's the term I'm thinking? Like you don't belong.
And like imposter syndrome?
Yes, imposter syndrome. Sorry. But, so like when you have that questioning of you, it triggers that part of you that's like, maybe I'm wrong. Should I look this up? So it is kind of easy to squash women because we've grown up with some of that, Yeah.
And it's even worse when a woman's reporting harassment or reporting something that happened to her, and she's not believed, like then
you can get gaslit.
Like, and then she's, it's not even about something that is, some work topic that's like, there's, lots of other experts on. Well, no, you're the expert on your own experience. You know what happened to you. And then, like you said, you're being gaslit into disbelieving, what you were saying, happened in terms of being harassed or retaliated against.
Well, that leads into
the next
hostility.
one. Yes, hostility.
Hostility, which can be subtle or really overt. And
it's like harassment, and harassment can be, often we think of sexual harassment, which we break down all the types of sexual harassment in the book. It can be just, it can be without sexual harassment, it can be verbal abuse. Lots of women have gone through situations where they've been verbally abused by their coworkers or superiors. We talk about retaliation. So in the United States currently, if you have reported discrimination or harassment, legally there can be nothing. You cannot be demoted. You cannot be retaliated against. But unfortunately, it happens all the time. And sometimes it's not just being demoted or fired. It's subtle things like being ostracized, but it's still retaliation. And then we talk about the female hostility.
Female hostility, right.
Which we break down into two types: queen bee behavior and mean girl behavior. And before I talk about those types, just to be clear, I'm not calling, I try not to label people, but I do label behaviors. So I try not to call people queen bees or mean girls, but I do label the behavior. And I think the labels help, labeling the names for the behaviors help us identify and remember what it is. So queen bee behavior happens when a woman at the top or a superior fails to help the women underneath her, or actively blocks their promotion or opportunities. And that, again, often happens because the woman at the top is made to feel that if she loses her perch, that someone else is going to come behind, like that she can easily lose her perch and someone else is going to come behind her and take it. In the book, we relate the story of Katie Couric, who is, a very high-profile television journalist, right? She wrote a book, a memoir, and her memoir was called Going There. Very interesting memoir. In Going There, Katie Couric talks about how she actually exhibited some queen bee behaviors. Now, she did not call it queen. She did not use that term. But what she said was that I would help anybody, like any women, colleagues, as long as they weren't someone who was in the same role as she was, as long as they weren't other journalists. She said, because I recognize that somebody younger and somebody prettier could take over my spot at any time. And so the thing I commend Katie on is just being open about that, because
recognizing it.
Yeah. Like often women who have those behaviors, because it's kind of like, it doesn't feel good to say, oh, I've mistreated another woman. Right. But it was just nice to see somebody like admit to it and say, now I recognize that was not, productive behavior. Right.
And I think it's important to point out that, in this kind of society, this patriarchy we have, when these, mostly men are in power and, and they create this dynamic of competition among women when we shouldn't be competing with each other, so it's unfortunate. And it is commendable that she recognized that, because there's only a certain number of positions allowed for women, right?
Yep, that's right. And then the mean girl behavior is similar. It's when it happens between women who are peers or lower level women towards upper level women, or women in a more senior position in the hierarchy. And I'll give you an example of that in your own field. It's when nurses don't support the female doctors, right? We have examples of like when they're in the operating room, the operating theater, and they're the surgeon, and they don't get the responsiveness from the nurses that the male doctors get, right? There was a very good study. It was about something the researchers termed status leveling burden that is on women in these male-dominated positions. And what they meant by that was what the researchers meant by that was that the women, like the women doctors or the women in the higher level positions, they recognized that they had the need to try to equalize the status, because as women, we feel like we're all equal as women in the gender hierarchy, but then you introduce this organizational hierarchy, and the lower level women can sometimes not like that, because like who is she, So what the examples were in the research study was like some of the women doctors would like spend their time when they were on their off hours like baking cookies to bring to the nurses to stay in the nurses' good graces, And I've never been a physician, but I've talked to many physicians, and I know that you all have very, very long schedules, like and your shifts are not like 8-hour days, like, us who maybe work in an office world.
Yeah.
Like, and I think about either as a patient going to a doctor, like I want to know that my doctor went home, had time with their family, and was well rested, and then came back and wasn't feeling like they had to do all these extra things in order to, get the support, maintain the support of the, their support team around them.
I'm going to give you another example of that from my experience. Yeah. And it's so nice to have this term, status leveling. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't have a term.
Yeah.
But in residency many years ago, when the male doctors operated, like did a C-section, for example, they would just close the skin and leave. Okay. But us as female residents, for example, when it was a woman, she would stay and help the nurses clean the patient up, get the betadine off, and dress the skin. And I think it was a gesture to kind of make them, that's what it felt like.
That's a very good
the
example.
Men could get away with just going and doing their work, like finishing the notes and completing the case, but the women had to spend extra time to do the womanly things,
And that all pay, I know that all then, it circles back into the pay discrepancy between men and women physicians, right?
Yes.
That example, but also the example of, the women in the, when they're dealing with a patient and conversing with a patient, spending more time listening to the patient's concerns, knowing that they can't just get away with having some short conversation, right? So the male doctor can go deal with many more patients, get many more billable hours than what billable visits or whatever than what the female doctor can.
True. Absolutely. There's a lot of more small talk, I think, that's going on with the women when in a clinical visit. Okay. The last one, acquiescence.
Yes, acquiescence. So like I said, that is as a result of all the other barriers, women may acquiesce. They may revert or ever, go back and feel that they accept their status, as in the male dominated environment, accept their status and, not try to make change for themselves or for other women and not try to accept blame, blame themselves for organizational problems or problems that are outside of their control. And then, like I talked about, they may limit their own aspirations, so they may have an aspiration of, I want to become the leader of my department, or I want to become whatever the thing is. Well, I'm not going to do that because it's either I don't think I can do it, it's like a psychological glass ceiling, or that I can do it, but I just don't want to. I want to, make sure that I have a good quality of life, outside of work, right?
And this is where the challenges of motherhood definitely,
for sure,
constrain women, and they have to make the hard choices and take a hit. They often take a hit with their careers, right?
Yeah, we could have a whole other conversation about the layers
Yes, absolutely. I do want to point out that there's just so much more in the book. This went very fast and I have to wrap it up soon. So, I do encourage everyone to read your great book. I did get one audience question. So let's do that.
Yeah.
So her name it's from Erin Quinn. And she asked, what are the surprising ways women hold one another back? I think we talked a little bit about that. And then also, what is one small thing hiring managers of people can do to check their bias?
Oh, that's a really great question. So we did talk about queen bee and mean girl behavior, so I won't go through all that again. But as far as checking their bias, the quick tip I like to give people is the flip it to test it approach. And that is, if you're a hiring manager or you're on a search committee and you've got male candidates, you've got female candidates, and you start saying, thinking about, well, we hire this woman, she might get pregnant. So, what does that mean for us? Would you ever ask that question? Would you ever even consider that question for a man, right? So if you have a criticism or a concern about that you're thinking about for a female candidate, flip it and see if it makes sense if you apply it to a male candidate. And if it doesn't, take that concern off the table because it's an unfair concern. So it's called flip it to test it. Dr. Kristen Pressner, she's a sociologist, developed that technique, really easy technique to help you help you recognize that you may have an unconscious bias and help you to eliminate it.
Okay, I love that. Thank you. And another part of your book that I really like that I think people will find useful is it's not just pointing out all the problems. Every chapter ends with what advice for leaders, allies, and women themselves about how to tackle this. So it's really actually also very practical. So it's kind of like a I think an important book for any working woman, maybe any woman actually.
We think it's a great book to read and then keep it on your bookshelf because unfortunately, gender bias is not going away. And it's one of those things that, if you say, this is happening to me, I'm not sure what it is, you can pull that off yourself, find it, read about it, and then have solutions, to use whether you're a leader, an ally, or it's happening to you personally.
Right. So, Amy, what do you have for your, what are your future plans and projects? Are you working on another book? What else do you do?
Yeah, actually, we are working on another book, Dr. Dzubinski and I. We have research on, we've just published a peer-reviewed journal article in the Human Resource Development Quarterly on the 30 identity-based factors that impact women's experiences of bias and discrimination. And we had additional research that we had done where we basically asked women, aside from gender, what other aspects of your identity are impacting your experience? And it's things that you would expect and things that you maybe wouldn't expect. So it was like their age, their race, ethnicity, their religion, their sexual orientation, some of it was like their accent, their physical ability or disability. It was like these 30 different identity characteristics that have nothing to do with a woman's ability to do her job. And even ones that are tangent, I would say you may think are related, like one of them was education. It really wasn't about whether they had the whether they had the degree, the minimum level of education. It was like, well, you've got too much education, or your degree's not from the right school. Like there was always some excuse for why the women weren't right. In fact, the title of the article starts with "Never Quite Right." And so our next book is going to expand upon that concept and talk about the different excuses, that the identity-based excuses that women get for why they aren't right or aren't a fit, and then what can we do about it? So we're moving beyond gender into identity lens for our next book.
I hope you'll come back to talk about that. That's great.
I certainly will.
Yeah, that makes me think never quite right because you're not a man.
That's right. Right? Exactly.
Right. Mm-hmm. So it's hard. Yeah. Yep. So please tell us if you have any closing thoughts and then, where my audience can find you to follow your thoughts.
Yeah. So the closing thought is if you experience any of these things in the book, if you experience bias, try to not take it personally. It can feel hard because it can be hard because sometimes it feels very personal, but just understand it's a larger problem. It's not, and even if it feels personal, it's coming from a particular individual towards you, they are operating in this larger systemic patriarchy, the society that is, unfortunately still works under these stereotypes. So don't take it personally. Now I know that's not it's not an immediate fix to the problem, but when you don't take it personally, that can help you to come up with take the emotion out of the response and help you to come up with solutions that don't hold you back. And then to answer your question about where to find more information about me, I have a website. It's amy-diehl.com. So that's AMY-DIEHL.com. There's information about me. I do speaking. I do keynote speaking. I like Kirsty said, I've been an expert witness. I do consulting, and then there's information about the book and where to buy the book, and as well as all kinds of links to my published articles, which are available on the web.
Thank you so much, Amy. So I also like to leave with a closing thoughts. I'm going to do that before we end. So in the patriarchy, men have built a society and institutions that serve them and their needs, and not the needs of women or even the collective. But in the Gynarchy, we seek to recognize the barriers that women face, dismantle patriarchal systems, and work to build a more equal society that serves not just women, but everyone. So down with the patriarchy and up with the Gynarchy.
I love that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy. It's a great speaking to you.
Thank you for having me.
Did you enjoy this episode of the Gynarchy Podcast? Know someone else who might enjoy this conversation? Make sure to subscribe and share the show with your friends and family. Find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and just about anywhere you find podcasts. On social media, we can be found on Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok at The Gynarchy. Thank you so much for listening.